I genuinely believe the police did their job, but I believe that the intelligence and the evidence had already been interfered with. Now, of course, people will know that I've been to prison twice. I came back to Britain voluntarily because the extradition against me failed on the grounds that what I'd done was manifestly political. Of course it was. It was revealing the crimes of the British state. But I came back voluntarily 2 years later. The government then took 2 years to put me on trial. And I say the government, it wasn't the police prosecuting me. The police told me they wanted nothing to do with the prosecution. They had been ordered by New Labour to prosecute me and get me into court. And by the time we'd been through a series of pre-trial hearings, I was not allowed to speak freely in my defence. I was not allowed to cross-examine my accusers, the people on the witness stand against me, even though one of them was my boss in the service who had lied deliberately about the 12-day delay in passing on the photographs in the McNulty operation. I could have proved, therefore, that he was an unreliable witness if I'd been allowed to draw that material and cross-examine him, but I wasn't. In the judge's summing up, the judge actually told the jury they had to convict on the facts. And we all know, of course, in Britain, that you can acquit on the grounds of justice. That is a 300-year-old constitutional right in Britain that was taken away. So anyway, back into, after leaving all of this, after going to prison and so on, I found myself in a very peculiar position. We had to submit our book before we published it, otherwise we would have gone to prison again. They sat on the book for 15 months. And this period, crucially, was the time of the Hutton Inquiry, the Butler Inquiry. And of course, our stuff was all pertinent to this. We knew that the intelligence services made assessments on the basis of very, very little intelligence. If that had gone before MPs and the Cabinet prior to the publication of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction dossier, we would know, people would know absolutely that was the case, and they would not have trusted that dossier. There would have been no invasion of Iraq and no subsequent raising of the threat to our lives that has come with that, because that act is one of the biggest recruitment causes that Al-Qaeda could ever see. But then I was approached by the 9/11 Truth Movement in about May 2005. I'd had some suspicions about 9/11, some worries, should we say. When I'd seen the towers collapse, I'd felt extremely odd about it. I didn't know why, but I just knew something was wrong. And then it occurred to me when the 9/11 Truth Movement started talking to me. This was the first time in history that steel frame buildings have been brought down by fire, if you believe the official story. I'd also been worried about how I managed to identify 19 hijackers 3 days after the attacks. 3 days, when they had no prior intelligence. In Lockerbie, it took 2 years to bring indictments against Lamin, Fema and Abdul Basit McGrath. 2 years, not 3 days. I know from being involved in counter-terrorist operations that when a bomb goes off, it's chaos for everybody. MI5 doesn't have a crystal ball. It's got to find out the facts like everybody else. And it does that by asking people on the ground in the same way the government do, the same way that the media do. So for the first 24 hours, 48 hours, it is chaos. You don't do any investigating. So to believe a day after that, they can confidently turn around and say, we know these are the 19, even though there are no Arab names on the flight manifests. Even though there's no prior intelligence, they still claim they knew the 19. Now, in the case of the 19 hijackers, 9 of them have since gone on the public record to say that they are a lie. And we're not talking about some nebulous internet site saying this. We're talking about the BBC saying it, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, various prestigious newspapers in the US. Now, obviously here, we don't know who's telling the truth. We don't know whether the FBI is telling the truth or whether these people are telling the truth. It may be there's some kind of misinformation operation. There may be other explanations. It may be to do with mistaken identity, because some of them at least could say, well, I had my passport stolen when I was in the US. But the 9/11 Commission does not mention any of this. It accepts the FBI word that these are the 19 hijackers. So we are no wiser as to why the FBI think that. And certainly the FBI has admitted its information about them being the 19 hijackers would never stand up in court. So let's firstly have a look at the problems with the official story. And I say I'm not going to mince my words. This is an inside job. The evidence is overwhelming. The first indication to me, when I started to look at this, that something was up, was when procedure's not followed. I'm always very suspicious if you don't follow procedure. Like, for example, not forensicating the magic bullet in the Kennedy assassination. Now, why is it in every other murder bullets are forensicated but not in this one? Why is it in every terrorist investigation I've been involved with, and as is in fact required by law in the UK and the US, that you do not interfere with the crime scene until it has been forensicated? What happened in 9/11? Less than 1% of the steel from ground zero was forensicated. It's all now being shipped off to China, where it's being melted down. That to me looks like someone trying to cover their tracks, especially when you realise that the 1% that was forensicated showed traces of sulphur. Sulphur is in thermate, an explosive used in controlled demolition. This is our evidence, our smoking gun. And then you look at it and think, controlled demolition. Does the collapse of the Twin Towers match the official story or controlled demolition? The official story says, this is put forward by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that burning airline fuel weakened the columns of the Twin Towers, bowing them outwards, so the floors fell on top of one another. This is known as the pancake effect. Now obviously there's some major problems with this. Those towers come down in 10 seconds. There are 110 stories in total. That's about 11 floors per second. Okay, you could argue that the impact point's very important. You're still talking about 8 or 9 floors a second. Now in the pancake theory, of course, floors are still attached. They'd offer some resistance. Now even if each floor only offered half a second's resistance, that's a click, half a second's resistance, it would still take 45 seconds for those towers to fall, for the 90 floors below the impact zone to fall. So clearly, the 10 seconds is much more consistent with controlled demolition than it is with the official story. But the other problem with the official story is that the laws of science don't support it. When people accuse us of being conspiracy theorists and not looking at all the evidence, we can very easily turn around to them and say, what about your evidence? It doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. Airline fuel in those conditions would burn at about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel begins to melt at 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Clearly, it didn't get hot enough in those buildings to actually bring down, to melt the steel, to bring down the towers. Now this has now been recognised by another official body in the US. The National Institute of Science and Technology have now undermined the official story by saying this is impossible. The pancake effect is a physical impossibility. This is what we've been saying for 4 years in the 9/11 Truth Movement. Finally, an organ of the American state has caught up with us. Unfortunately, they've come up with another cockeyed theory. Their theory is that somehow the trusses broke off from the central columns and pulled the outer walls in. Now, that may have happened to a certain extent, but you'd have stresses where the plane, or whatever it was, hit the building, went in. But that would not account for how the building would fall down in 10 seconds. How it would fall down uniformly. It does not account for how reinforced concrete can be turned into pulverized dust and blown out of those towers. I'd say to anybody, look at the evidence yourself. You've got eyes to become a witness to this because it's recorded. Those towers look like bloody great fireworks. They do not show evidence of collapse consistent with either trusses breaking or with, as I say, steel melting. It never got hot enough. And it's a day of firsts to say. The South Tower, was the first steel frame building in history to be brought down by fire, if you believe the official story. But that doesn't just happen once that day, of course. It happens again when the North Tower goes down. And then, of course, it happens for a third time. How many people here have heard of Building 7 of the World Trade Center complex? That's great, fantastic. I'm glad our message is getting through. To those who haven't, at 5:20 that day, Building 7 of the complex, a 47-story skyscraper, collapsed into its own footprint, 5:20 p.m. The 9/11 Commission, nowhere in its report, deals with the collapse of Building 7. The Federal Emergency Management Agency tries to say that Building 7 was brought down by fires in the basement, but it actually admits that this is extremely unlikely. It's a very low probability of occurrence, to use the scientific language. So Building 7, of course, is the only skyscraper in history to be brought down by fire that wasn't hit by a plane. And when you see the footage, again, the official story fires, our story, controlled demolition. Watch the footage. Building 7 goes in the middle first. It then falls down into its own footprint in 6.5 seconds. Those are all the hallmarks of controlled demolition. The reason it goes in the middle first is they take out the central column, so the building falls in on its own footprint and doesn't fall elsewhere. But if you need more evidence than that, I can refer you to a documentary on PBS in the US, in which the owner of the site, Larry Silverstein, says, the decision was made to have it pulled, and it came down. Pull is an industry term for a controlled demolition. So clearly he's admitting to controlled demolition here. Clearly afterwards he's told he can't do that. He puts out a statement saying, I was talking about pulling the contingent from the building. Even though, from the context of the way he says it, the decision was made to have it pulled and the building came down. It wasn't. The decision was made to have it pulled and then the building came down. It was a surprise. And of course, the contingent had already been pulled from the building. The building had already been evacuated. So this statement makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. This was clear evidence that was not examined by the 9/11 Commission that shows Building 7 was brought down by controlled demolition. Now, the National Institute of Science and Technology is now going to look at how Building 7 might have been brought down by controlled demolition. So again, an American official body, years after us, is coming around to our way of thinking. Now, why are these smoking guns? To my mind, it is absolutely impossible to think that Al-Qaeda has the capability of being able to get into the World Trade Center complex, plant bombs at the strategic joists to bring down those 3 towers. That is way outside their capability. It is well within the capability, though, of those disloyal elements of the US intelligence services who would want to create an attack like that to justify war in the Middle East. And in fact, Marvin Bush, the president's brother, was involved with security at the World Trade Center for a very long time. And in fact, there are reports in the days running up to 9/11, for the first time in history, the towers were shut down. Bomb-sniffing dogs were removed. CCTV was turned off. So clearly, the Americans who were carrying out an inside job had the opportunity to do this. It was way beyond Al-Qaeda because there was security at the World Trade Center then because of the 1993 bombing. So clearly, there were smoking guns around the collapse of the Twin Towers. But even if they can deal with that, they've then got to deal with the Pentagon. And this is where it starts to get really comical. Well, it would be comical if people hadn't died, of course. We're expected to believe that Hani Hanjour, a man who has very little experience of flying a small turboprop Cessna or whatever it is, suddenly gets into a 757 and takes it over. But not only does he take it over, he actually flies it 330 degrees around the Pentagon, dropping 7,000 feet. Now, airline pilots have said that manoeuvre is impossible. But according to the official story, the plane then came in, knocked lampposts out of the ground, bounced off the lawn, and went into the first or the ground floor of the Pentagon. Now, let's look at this stage by stage. Hani Hanjour was not capable of executing that turn. The plane, according to airline pilots, would have fallen apart. Passenger airliners are not made for manoeuvrability. And then we've got to ask the question, why did he go around the Pentagon? What was he doing? Why didn't he just put it straight in? What was he doing? Counting the sides? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's the Pentagon, lads, we can go in. Crucially, of course, he actually hit the one bit of the Pentagon that had no military staff in, because it was being renovated. So out of the 155 people who died at the Pentagon, a tiny handful actually belonged to the US military. The rest were contractors. There were no military deaths. But then, of course, the official explanation has to explain why, in the photographs taken directly after this hit, there is no airline wreckage on the graphs. If a plane smashes into reinforced concrete, there'll be an explosion. And in that explosion, you absolutely certainly, of course, get stuff blown back out of the explosion onto the lawn. There is virtually nothing. Now, the official explanation for why there is no plane, and this is, again, it's interesting because we're talking about first. I was talking about first earlier on about buildings collapsing because of fire. Another first is this is the first time in history an aeroplane has completely disappeared on impact. But not only is it the first time in history, it's the second time. because it happens for Flight 93 in Shanksville as well. So again, a day of firsts, historical first, but also a day of historical seconds. And they say that the plane behaved like a fluid, then went up in a ball of smoke and flame. In fact, what that's actually saying to you is that the plane was vaporized. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly not gullible enough to believe that. But if there is anybody here gullible enough to believe that, I would then say to them, if this fire was hot enough to vaporize titanium, which is what planes are made of, why didn't it vaporize human bodies, which are made out of carbon? How can the Pentagon claim to have identified 184 people who were on that plane by DNA if they've been vaporized? That is impossible. But even if they come up with an explanation for that, they've then got to tell us why there is almost a perfectly circular hole of about 16 to 18 feet in the back of the C-ring of the Pentagon. This means that whatever's got there has gone through 6 layers of reinforced concrete, each 1.5 feet thick. Now, the thing about a civilian airliner, of course, is made out of lightweight alloys. The nose is made out of carbon. They are not made to penetrate reinforced concrete. Clearly, missiles are, though. And again, from my knowledge of working in the service, I would have to say the only thing I know that could make that kind of hole get through those layers of reinforced concrete would be a missile. And having a missile like that in America is way beyond the capability of Al-Qaeda. But even if they try to tell us Al-Qaeda could have done it, there is one riposte we can make to that. And again, this is a smoking gun. Why didn't the Pentagon's anti-missile system simply shoot whatever it was going towards the Pentagon out of the air? Anything not sending a friendly fire code would have been shot down. That, of course, includes a 757. It includes a missile fired by Al-Qaeda. Of course, the only thing that could get through would be a missile fired by somebody in the American military who knew the friendly fire codes for that day. This is another smoking gun not dealt with by the 9/11 Commission. But we in the 9/11 Truth Movement do our own research as well, and one of our activists has come up with some new stuff under the Freedom of Information Act. And he has got from the, this is actually from the National Safety and Transportation Board in the US, so this again is not conspiracy theory, this is absolutely solid information. They have reconstructed the path of Flight 77 based on radar data and what they said was black box flight data, which is astounding because up until that point they denied they had any black box flight data. And again, this is suspicious. Unless a plane goes down in the sea, you can virtually guarantee that you'll find the black box because it's made to be indestructible and because it has a homing beacon on it. You're actually taken to it by a pulse it sends out. So the fact they couldn't find the 4 black boxes that day, again, a day of firsts, it's highly suspicious. But this reconstruction, remember I was talking about Flight 77, the official story, it comes in over Interstate 395 and knocks the lamppost out of the ground. Now, it's a moot point whether actually a plane can do that. I don't think a civilian jet airliner can knock lampposts out of the ground. It's more likely the plane would have been taken down as well as the lamppost being moved. But on this information, it shows us that when, in the reconstruction, Flight 77 is 100 feet above those lampposts in this flight reconstruction. 100 feet above. So it can't knock lampposts out of the ground. And crucially, this reconstruction ends right there. It doesn't show the plane going down into the building. Presumably because it's an impossibility because it's so high up. It couldn't get down that quickly. So this is official information that now contradicts the official story. Of course, people will have seen some of the coverage in the papers. And again, I'd say everybody check this stuff out for yourself because they released some frames, allegedly from a Pentagon CCTV camera. And it was reported in all the papers that this was Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon. Until you watched them and realised there was no plane in those pictures. Or certainly there was no clear evidence of a plane. There was some evidence, perhaps at the side of the picture, there may have been a nose of a plane. But that was clearly not the rounded nose of a civilian jet airliner. It looked much more like the nose of an A3 US Sky Warrior, a military plane. Again, evidence that the military was involved.